Hi, I'm Chris McKenna, and this is Exam Debug. Today we're going to be having our first class on operating systems. So we're going to be looking at how operating systems work and how they fit together. And we'll have a look at some of the key points or the key parts of an operating system. So if you're interested in that, then please stay with us. Okay, great, welcome back. So let's have a quick look then. So what kind of operating systems do you know? So everywhere you're going to find, or everywhere in computers, you're going to find lots of different types of operating systems. Can you name these three here? This one, of course, is Microsoft Windows. This is the one that I'm using now. I've just upgraded to Windows 10 and it seems to be working quite well. Fingers crossed. This one here, maybe sort of a competitor with Windows. This is Linux, used by a lot of programmers and people who want to do more complicated things with their systems, or more stable things perhaps. This one here, maybe you know from your phone. This is Android. So Android is from Google and it's used on lots of different types of phones, but it has the same operating system. There might be other ones, like iOS is obviously a big competitor to Android, and there are different operating systems out there, and even each of these have their own different versions that have different powers and abilities. So, but what is an operating system? What does it do? Well, here's a list of some of the things that an operating system is responsible for. So if you have a quick look down there, you'll see a particular word comes up again and again. So, manages. So what an operating system is it's a piece of software which helps to manage, or which manages, your computer system. So if we have a look at this diagram, a user will usually interact with an application, and that application will then talk to the operating system, and the operating system will in turn talk to the hardware, and vice versa. So it's the bridge between these two, and it manages what's going on. We'll go into that in more detail. But in some of the specifics, so it manages inputs and outputs to the system. This might be peripheral devices, it might be other things. It manages the system resources, so it manages memory, CPU time. We'll come back to this. It manages the files, so files, folders might be what you're familiar with, but that could be different for different operating systems. Provides utilities, so gives you little tools that you can use to help make your system more efficient. For example, the defragmenter, which you may or may not know, it takes all the blocks of spaces that you have and puts it together into one big space, so that it's better for installing single programs in one place rather than installing bits of the program around your system. Likewise, it manages computer security. So it makes sure maybe your antivirus is there, it checks the ports perhaps, maybe a firewall is perhaps part of it. I think Windows comes with its own firewall. And this will be checking to see the traffic coming in and out. When you want to install a new program on Windows, you get a security alert saying, are you sure you want to run this file? Okay, and this one we're going to come back to. Manages startup, a very important one. So how does your computer start? How do you go from a dead machine to something that's kind of alive? And the last one is going to be our class next time round, is user interfaces. But we'll come back to that one in time. Okay, so before we go into any more detail, what I'd like you to do is pick maybe one or two operating systems, or different versions perhaps, of the same operating system, and if you could compare them together, what are the different features of, say, Android versus iOS versus Windows? What would be the different features available? What are the advantages and disadvantages, and what things do they all have in common. So research, see what you can find out about those things. Okay, moving on. So like we said, operating systems, part of it is going to be managing the startup of your computer. So how does that actually work? So what do you think happens when you turn on a computer? So operating systems are not automatic. Software can't load automatically. You need something to trigger the whole process and make it start going. You need a spark to light the fire. And that spark, that thing that starts everything off, is your BIOS. So BIOS stands for Basic Input and Output System. So what happens is on your motherboard, on a chip, a ROM chip, we'll come back to RAM and ROM later if you haven't done before. On your ROM chip, you will have the very, very basics of how to start up your system. So when you turn it on, the power will go into your system, the chip will power up, and that will start the process of loading your computer, and of loading your operating system. And so the BIOS triggers the operating system and gets things started. The BIOS also maybe gives some information about the different inputs and output systems on your computer, hence the name. So before you can start reading the hard drive, the computer has to know the very basics of how to talk with the hard drive. So before it can do anything more, it has to be able to read some basic inputs and outputs. Maybe it's a hard drive or a CD, wherever you're booting your system from. Okay, let's have a look. So can you try and find your BIOS on the motherboard? So if you have an old motherboard, we're going to have some of these in class. If you have an old motherboard, have a look, see, can you find where the BIOS is located? If you want to take apart your own computer, that's up to you. I generally think it's a good idea to be able to open things up and play around with them, but you have to be very careful, otherwise you may break things. So it's your responsibility if you choose to open things up. But yeah, if you've got an old one, that would be best. See if you can locate where is the BIOS. What does it actually look like? Where is the physical ROM chip? The other thing you can do is you can actually access some of the BIOS settings. So when you start up your computer, you'll see there might be an option along the top usually, and it will say something like press F4 to enter setup or something like that. And by doing that, you can usually get a screen up that looks like this, and you can change some of the settings, and you can see some information about your BIOS. So while it predominantly starts in ROM, there might be other parts that are flexible to some extent. Again, if you're going to go into this, you do so at your own risk, and be careful. Don't change things unless you're sure that it's something that you can actually reverse or that you want to change. So please be very careful with that one. Okay, so just to be clear though, the BIOS itself is not actually part of the operating system. It's just the spark, it's just the trigger that starts the operating system running. But all of that, all of the more complex things are then loaded by the operating system. So the BIOS is part of your motherboard and it starts the operating system. But then in terms of managing the startup, the operating system then takes over and puts everything into place that you need to run your system. Okay, so the next thing we're going to have a look at is managing inputs and outputs. So for managing inputs and outputs, we have something called drivers. So drivers are kind of like dictionaries, or maybe a phrase book would be a better example, that let your operating system talk to a peripheral device. Now, peripheral device is basically an external device that you attach to your main computer. For example, a mouse, keyboard, pretty much anything that has these USB ports is probably going to be a peripheral device. So the operating system uses a language book, uses a phrase book to be able to talk to this peripheral device and find out what it does. And the operating system is in charge of managing that. Now, maybe back in the day, maybe 10 years ago, what would happen is I would buy a new printer, and that new printer would come with a CD, and the CD would contain the drivers. Now, if I plugged in the printer, it would not work until I had installed the appropriate drivers. Only when I installed the drivers could I talk to the peripheral device. Now, these days we have plug and play. So what happens is the operating system has a store of drivers. It has a whole bunch of drivers already part of it, and these are updated with, say, Windows Update and other things. And what will happen is when we plug in the device will have some kind of ID. The operating system will say, okay, I don't know how to talk to you yet. So it will go into the bookstore, it will go into the store, the driver store, and it will find the translation book for this particular peripheral. It will take it from the library and it will install it into its daily use book. It will put it in its school bag for daily use. And that way it can easily talk to this device. So the driver is still being installed, it's just that we don't see it. We plug in and this happens automatically and it happens very quickly. So we don't have to worry about it like we did in the past. So what's really happening is we've got a peripheral device like a mouse and it's moving things about. I move my hand and it changes coordinates. The operating system, using this language book, using this driver, is able to understand what these signals mean to some extent. And then it's going to be using the CPU to process these signals, which is in turn going to result in my mouse moving around the screen. But that wouldn't be possible without this connection. It would be like two people speaking different languages and neither would understand each other. So the operating system is in charge of managing those drivers. It's the manager, as we said before, for the peripheral devices, for the inputs and outputs of this system. Okay, so the next bit we're going to have a look at is how to manage resources, or how the operating system manages resources. So to do this, we have, or part of the operating system is called the kernel, which to me sounds a bit like Kernel from the army, but it's not. It's spelled slightly differently, but it might help you remember because it's a manager type bossy thing, the kernel. So let's think about this. Applications. Let's imagine applications are students. We've got 10 students in one classroom, and we have different resources that the students need. So let's say, for example, the classroom only has one computer. So what's going to happen? Are all these applications, are all these students allowed to fight over who gets to use the computer? No, we can't have that. So what we have is we put a person in charge, in this case perhaps a teacher, or a student class leader, maybe better, a student prefect, is going to be in charge, and they're going to be in charge of allotting different students time on that computer, depending on their priorities and depending on how much time they've had before. So there's different ways that operating systems do this, and we're not going to go into detail about that. But basically, part of the operating system has to be in charge of sharing out the different times that we have on different devices. So for example, maybe you're playing a computer game, and so you're going to need a lot of memory. So this application is going to say to the kernel, hey, I need lots of memory and I need lots of CPU space, and I'm going to be accessing the mouse and other things. So the kernel is going to give it lots of different things. But then maybe something happens. Maybe you press Alt Tab in your game and you switch to writing an email. So then your email application, or probably your browser, is also going to be requesting memory space. And so the kernel is going to have to assign a certain amount of memory space to your email application, depending on how much it needs. But that will mean it's going to have to kick out some of your game memory to make space for the application, for your email. So just remember that although it appears that you have many different applications running at the same time, your CPU can only actually do one thing at a time. So if it's dealing with a game, it can only deal with the game. If it's dealing with the email application, it can only deal with the email application. So the kernel is going to be in charge of deciding who gets access to what and how much of it gets access to. If you want to see this going maybe in action, load up a big fancy game with something with lots of memory space being used, lots of graphics, and press Alt Tab and go to a browser. Suddenly your computer system will go, it won't crash hopefully, but it will suddenly be going very, very, very slowly. It will take a long time for your browser to start up. Why? Because the game has said, I'm going to be using all of the memory, and I'm going to be using all of the CPU speed. And so it's using all of these things, and what's happened is something unexpected. You pressed Alt Tab, it's unexpected, and so the kernel is going to have to back up all of your memory that you're using in RAM and store it maybe on your hard disk somewhere. Likewise, it's going to have to save the place that you're using your CPU instructions. It's going to have to back up. It's going to have to stop that process and back it up somewhere so that it's ready to start again. And then it's going to have to load your email application into RAM and start assigning some CPU speed to that as well. And so that changeover is going to really slow down your computer. And the kernel will try and do it best as he can or she can, but it only has a limited amount of space. Okay, and that also means, by the way, if you're opening lots of different applications, like your email, you've got a game running in the background, you've got 17 browser windows open, you're playing music, and you're watching a movie all at the same time, which is impossible, I know. But if you're watching them all at the same time, this means your computer is going to go slower and slower and slower. Okay, so that's your kernel. It's in charge of managing who gets access to what. Okay, so finish off then today. I want you to think about the operating systems that you looked into before, and especially think about things like drivers, the kernel, and what else did we cover? Drivers, the kernel, and maybe the startup times, things like this. So pick a famous person. Could be anyone, doesn't have to be any of these three, but pick a famous person, and I want you to write down what operating system would you recommend for them, thinking about their job or perhaps their personality. What operating system would you recommend for them and why? Okay, great. So that's it for today on operating systems. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below and I'll try and get back to you at some point. And of course, remember you can make your own videos, perhaps explaining things, or you can send us your work and we'll post it online as well. So if you check out Exam Debug, our website, and yeah, feel free to subscribe as well. Thank you very much, and good luck with your exams.